Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Social Flight Live. I'm Jeff Simon. We have a spectacular show for you this evening. Legendary astronaut Charlie Precourt is here. We are going to talk about his story, so many experiences, and especially his experience working with Russia in space and on all those programs. It's just fascinating, and I cannot wait to get to that discussion. Before we get started, just a few things. First of all, we just completed another prize period in SocialFlight's Fly to Win Challenge. We'll be announcing that winner shortly, and we are now in a new prize period. So all you need to do is get the SocialFlight mobile app for Apple and Android devices. Get out there, check in to win. And there's a new release of SocialFlight that is now out. It's called 9.0. We have thousands of destinations to go to, the best places to fly. You find them all for free on SocialFlight. Just go download 9.0 for your device, your Apple, your Android device, and get out there and fly. And if I might ask a favor to any of our supporters out there, we can always use reviews. And so if you like it, please go out there, post a positive review, and help us do more for you. It's all free, everything there on SocialFlight to support General Aviation. Tonight's broadcast is brought to us by Avionics and their amazing AV30, AV20, Sky Beacon, Tail Beacon X, Sky Sensor, so many things that work in either an electronic flight instrument in front of you or to help support your transponder and ADS-B needs. And I'll tell you, they are just coming out with products so fast I can barely keep up. We do a lot of testing of products coming out, and at Sun and Fun next week, they are going to be showing off a number of other things that I'm sure you'll read about and see about. And so special thanks to them. Be sure to check them out. And if you do talk to them, please thank them for supporting SocialFlight. Now, on to tonight's guest. Colonel Charles Precourt is a veteran of 4 space flights above with the Space Shuttles Columbia, Atlantis, and Discovery. He has logged over 932 hours in space, serving in a variety of roles from mission specialist to pilot, commander, so many different things on all of those missions. He piloted and commanded several missions which involved docking with the Russian Mir space station and was heavily involved in Russian-US space relations as well as the International Space Station collaboration. As Director of Operations for NASA at the Yuri Gagarin Cosmonaut Training Facility in Star City, Russia, he was responsible for joint US-Russian Shuttle Mir program issues and was instrumental in the cooperation between the United States and Russia in space. Colonel Precourt also served as the Chief of the Astronaut Office from 1998 until 2002. But back here on the atmosphere on Earth, his terrestrial flight experience is astounding as well, because that includes over 7,500 hours in over 60 types of civil and military aircraft. He holds commercial pilot, multi-engine instrument, glider, and certified flight instructor ratings, and is also a jet pilot. And so just really has flown just about everything out there. I am absolutely thrilled to have him join us here tonight on SocialFlight Live. So please help me welcome Colonel Charlie Precourt. Hey there, how are you?
Jeff, how are you? Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight on the program. And I just want to say one of the things I've wanted to have you on the show for so long, and one of the reasons for that is you bridged a time in history where despite what was happening with politics across the country, nations were able to come together in scientific means in space. And we're living right now at a time, of course, where Russia's invasion of Ukraine and so many things that are ostracizing them justly so worldwide. It's a very difficult time, I can imagine, for NASA, and this is something you have personally been through.
It's very much so, and when we did the first docking with the Russians in '95, it was 20 years to the day almost since the Apollo-Soyuz, which was a brief thaw in the Cold War, and in 1975, led by Tom Stafford at the time. And it wasn't for another 20 years that we were able to get a program together with the Russians that has lasted now through the International Space Station And in spite of the difficulties at the higher political levels, the crews and the control centers, both in Russia and in the U.S., continue to operate the International Space Station quite well. But
Yeah.
it's bound to be very frustrating for a lot of them.
Oh, I can only imagine. I'd like to come back to that and make sure people understand your history and your background, because that in itself is truly fascinating. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got started and what brought you into first the Air Force and then to NASA?
Certainly, I'd be happy to. I grew up out there in Hudson, Massachusetts, not far from where you're located, and went to a very small school system. The town only had about 15,000 people at the time. But the space program was growing up around me as I was growing up, and I'll never forget being in school, coming back from summer break, and the teacher asked us to go around the room, reintroduce ourselves, and tell everybody what we wanted to do when we grew up. And the gal in the row next to me introduced herself again to everybody in the class and said when she grew up she wanted to be an astronaut, and everybody started laughing because they realized how much of a long shot that was. And I just thought, that's what I was going to say, but I'm not saying it now. uh, it was such a fascinating thing growing up to see the space program motivate so many of us to pursue careers in aerospace, and that was largely what a lot of us in my generation look back upon as that driving force. And then I had my dad flew light airplanes out of Hanscom Field there, and often for business, and he would take me along. And Mike Goulian, who's the air show performer today, he is a bit younger than me, but he and his dad and my dad partnered together at the flight school over there. My dad was kind of a silent partner, got me into flying at a very young age. And my uncle was in the Air Force, so it all kind of converged to vector me towards the Air Force Academy and to pursue military flying, which is what the Apollo astronauts had all done.
Wow,
So
I didn't
it
realize.
just was laid out in front of me as something that this is clear to me from a very young age that this would be so exciting and so much fun, and it's available to me, so why not pursue it?
I didn't realize the connection between you and Mike Goulian. Of course, in my
Oh yeah,
backyard, he's also been on the show, a friend. I
yeah.
mean, that's
His
pretty
his
wild.
his dad signed me off on my private pilot's license when I was 18, so goes back a long way. Yeah,
It's a small world, I'll tell you.
it is.
Really
It
is.
is.
So,
Yeah.
did you know that you wanted to go into the Air Force when you were in high school?
Yes, by the time I was eighth, ninth grade, I was pretty much based on the guidance I had heard from my uncle who had been in the Air Force and really having, been bitten by the flying bug, learning alongside my dad. It became the path of most obvious um, desire for me to pursue. So went and in some respects the Vietnam War was at its height when I was in high school, and very few of my classmates had much interest in joining the military, and I think that worked to my advantage. Had a little less competition. Nowadays it's very difficult to get into a lot of colleges, and in particular the military academies, but I found that it was a really good choice to have made at that point in my life.
And that was you went to the academy out in Colorado?
Yes, yeah, I went to the Air Force Academy right out of high school, um, pursued a degree in aeronautical engineering, and I was always not only enthralled with flying airplanes, but understanding how they fly and the engineering aspects of them, which kind of early on, while I was at the academy, got me interested in a flight test career. I wanted to fly fighters because flying a fighter is a very competitive and physically demanding sport, if you will. It's a young man's game for sure, or young gal's game. And it's very physically demanding. And I flew F-15s for well over 10 years and did a lot of flight tests on the heels of that out at Edwards, California. Flew dozens and dozens of different airplanes and enjoyed all of that, which was again kind of a prerequisite that I was filling to be able to go to the astronaut program. And so that one thing led to another, if you will.
What was your time like at the academy? A lot of people talk about that being very kind of transformative, and ultimately you mentioned you kind of dropped the bomb that you were flying F-15, so that's kind of the pick of the litter, isn't it?
It was. I had to wait a little bit. I graduated at the top of my flight school, um, and in that point in time, you didn't get to choose your assignment. The instructors chose for you, and they wanted me to come back and instruct as well. So I spent 3 years instructing in the T-37 and the T-38 before I got my final choice to go to the F-15. But yeah, the academy is a very um, it it at a very young age, 18 to 21, when you're there, you're really put in such a challenging position, day in and day out, the disciplined lifestyle, the long days, hard work. It teaches you self-discipline and motivation more than probably any place else you could go to school. I would venture to say at the same time that a lot of folks who go to larger schools have to fend for themselves, and that's challenging too. But the demands of being in a military lifestyle while also going through a college education is really formative, like you say. I enjoyed it a lot. I played ice hockey there, in Hudson growing up. And I ended up going on an exchange to the French Air Force Academy, where I got to fly a number of French Air Force airplanes while I was there my senior year, and then went off to a full year of Air Force flight school.
Wow. And then when did you get involved in flight tests? Tell us a little bit about what that is, because I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand what being a flight test pilot encompasses.
Yeah, it's a combination of flying skills and engineering. So the ultimate purpose of a test pilot is to take a new prototype airplane and turn it into something that can be flown in a deployed manner in hundreds or thousands of times in certain types of airplanes. So early on in the development of an airplane, of course, the engineers are tweaking, they're changing the design, they're finding out things that didn't go as planned. And so you're part of an engineering team that is evaluating a design for suitability for the mission. So if it's a fighter, you're doing a lot of things relative to the stability of engine performance, structural load capabilities, just a lot of the first time verifications of the design before it's released to the field for the pilots out in the field to use it. So F-15 came along and had been tested in the late 70s, early 70s while I was at the academy, and then I got to fly it in the early 80s. And then I went back to Edwards and actually flight tested the F-15E model, which was a derivative of the original F-15. I flew the very first two F-15E models, and we did all kinds of envelope controllability tests, put it out of control a few times, popped a few engines a few times, but it's all about defining that envelope. So if you bottom line is whatever you read in a flight manual was created either through analysis or flight test. And whenever you look at a performance page in your flight manual and you can look up in the corner and it says the source of this data is flight test, you know that some folks were out actually measuring that stuff. So it's very interesting work and requires very precise flying so that you are able to measure exactly what the airplane did in a precise manner.
I think that's one of the things that has amazed me the most. I have had the pleasure of flying with a test pilot and a professional military test pilot. And what, we think of some of the things you talked about, like pushing an envelope, determining an envelope, putting things out of control. The part that blew me away the most is the repeatability and the exactness of performing the job at a level I have never seen any other pilot do. You say pitch up to 6 degrees, the aircraft is going to be at 6 degrees. You say climb at 137 knots, it's going to be exactly there.
Yeah, so that's right. And we learn what's called flight test techniques to be able to, in a modern flight test, there's a telemetry stream coming off the airplane, and there's an engineering team in a control room that's looking at your data in real time. And they're trying to say, okay, does this airplane at this thrust level do 350 knots or does it do 340 knots? And if you're all over the place, they can't ever get a stable point to say, yeah, we just proved that it does 350 at that power setting. So we're taught to be able to hold what's, the most simple of flight test techniques for a test pilot is called a trim point. Very little variation in altitude, less than 10, 15 feet in altitude and less than 2 or 3 knots of oscillation in airspeed for, as much as 30 seconds. And that's essentially being able to take your hands off it, not have it move. So there's a lot of precision that goes into being able to get data that you can rely on in a flight manual or in performance calculations. And if you're not precise, then you're going to have sloppiness in the results, and the users in the field are not going to be able to rely on it. So.
The other thing that I have been told, which I think translates to where we're going to talk about the space flight, is that the other key is it's all about communication. So what you're experiencing somehow has to be articulated and explained to the people who can make changes or
Right.
who can do that.
It actually explained to the end user eventually the wording that goes into a flight manual. If you do a little exercise and go back and look at like a 1972 or a 1967 Cessna 172 or Cessna 150 flight manual, no, it's about 15 pages thick and there's not a whole lot of description. I'll never forget going back and reading that for the stall characteristics of a Cessna 150, stalls conventionally. That was it. And today, when you read through a stall description, it'll tell the pilot exactly what to expect in terms of stick forces increase, and the nose will pitch down, very little rolling, or maybe some airplanes have quite a bit of rolling. So that description, that communication comes from the pilot who flew the tests. And then if it's not meeting the requirements, they have to go back with the engineering team and say, hey, this has got to be tweaked up a little bit so that when we do write this description, it falls within the requirements of what's acceptable. So that the user pilot in the mission doesn't have difficulty with it.
Tell me a little bit about your transition or your time in service and then how that transitioned to NASA.
So the military test pilots and flight test engineers are assigned to NASA if they're selected for the astronaut program. They're assigned to NASA as a military assignment. So we're still on active duty when we're first at NASA. So I stayed as a active duty Air Force officer for my first 10 years at NASA. And then I retired from the Air Force while I was still at NASA. In my last 5 years there, I was a civil servant. So it's considered a military assignment for those that are on active duty. And NASA likes to select from that group of folks because of the training and the background they have. You can't find flight test engineering experience anywhere else. And that kind of engineering development work and discipline and examination of a machine is really what goes into assessing any spacecraft, rocket or spacecraft, and understanding its capabilities and limitations. It's very much an experimental environment and an experimental endeavor. So the test pilot capabilities that the military produces are second to none because of the nature of testing military aircraft. So NASA takes advantage of that by tapping into that cadre, if you will.
And is that true of all pilots, commanders, flight engineers? What roles?
It's changing a little bit because of the nature of the space station. We no longer have the shuttle, which was a very pilot centered kind of machine because of the nature of the winged vehicle and so forth. There's a lot more automation. If you talk to folks that have flown as part of the SpaceX Dragon capsule missions to the space station, there's a lot more automation now. But at the same time, the skills and engineering training of the test pilots and flight test engineers is still very much applicable, but they are expanding the backgrounds that they pull upon for commanders and flight engineers of the crews of the space station. So there's a lot of engineers who come from other parts of the system, if you will, from corporations or from academia,
Mhm.
And there's also medical doctors who have flown in the role of space station commander. It's a different environment, different task, if you will, than the dynamics of flying a shuttle kind of vehicle. So they've been able to broaden the scope of who's suitable for those kinds of and properly trained and experienced for those kinds of roles.
Aside from the automation, though, isn't it in a way kind of like harkening back to the Apollo and some of the other days because they weren't really winged, but um, you still had people with the ability of piloting. Uh,
Yeah, and there are piloted modes for those vehicles, like there were in the Soyuz, for instance, has some piloted modes. But they do train engineers to operate them in those piloted modes, and they're typically backup modes. And so it's just a question of the amount of training that you dedicate to the individuals with the
hmm.
proper background to be able to do it.
So tell me about your kind of initiation into going to NASA and what it was like.
Uh, so my selection was a couple of years after the Challenger accident. So there were some astronauts who chose during the downtime from Challenger to return to their military assignments. So Roy Bridges came out of the shuttle program back to Edwards and became my commander. And he encouraged me to apply for the program. And I had thought that it might be too early because of the recovery from the accident, but I did get selected in the 1990 class to join the program. The first year is you join a group of classmates and they take you through an indoctrination that includes orientation about what the NASA mission is at all the various centers, everything from the Johnson Space Center, which you can think of as astronaut training and flight control, mission control, Kennedy Space Center, which is the launch complex and payload preparations and the landing systems for the Kennedy landing runway, all the way to places like NASA Ames out in California, where we had large wind tunnels and massive complex simulators. Most of us are familiar with the motion-based simulators that are on stilts that pitch, roll, and yaw. Take that and put the platform on another movable platform that can translate fore, aft, left, right, up, down, and now you have the ability for the vehicle to not only pitch, roll, and yaw, but to slew. And we did all of the testing in that simulator for the crosswind landing limits on the shuttle because it would simulate the side loads that you would experience on touchdown because it was able to slew like that. Very complex simulators. So they would take us around to these different centers in NASA to get accustomed to what capabilities were where. And the role of the astronaut when they're not on a crew to go fly is to really integrate with the NASA engineers and scientists around the community to make sure that their capabilities are being brought to bear for the missions. So that indoctrination in the first year of learning what was where, who had what capabilities was part of our training, as was kind of the basics, Shuttle 101 of all the systems and getting into basic simulators and so forth. And then years 2 and 3, you would be given an assignment. I was given an assignment as a Capcom, sitting on a console, talking to crews on orbit for other missions and preparing myself for my own role on a crew. Comes pretty naturally when you're doing that because you're engaged in real time during a mission with the crews on orbit, or for launch and entry as well. And then after that period of indoctrination, you get put on a crew and you spend about a year focused on the details of your mission. It's highly choreographed and 10 days of hour by hour all programmed out for everybody on the crew. So it's a lot of training.
Wow. Was there a cultural shift and difference going to NASA from test pilot in the military and
It's
what
a
is it
really
like?
good, it's a good observation to ask that because there is, you are joining a group of professionals from other walks of life, medical doctors, scientists, engineers, um, and the beauty of it is they all bring such a great array of wisdom and knowledge that you're always learning from each other. They know so many things that you've never been exposed to because of the type of career path you might have been on, and vice versa. They learn a lot from us. We would put our mission specialists who were doctors or engineers, scientists in the backseat of the T-38, and they'd become quite good at being a crew person, crew member for us. And the whole purpose of that was, in fact, to make them operationally a very good crew member in the shuttle, so that they could spend hours and hours preparing for operational tasks in a vehicle like the shuttle. You just can't jump in the shuttle and know what you're going to be up against and know how to handle it. So T-38 was a great training ground for crew operations like that. So there was a very distinct cultural difference, but I found it to be very positive. Everybody it considers it a team activity, and everybody is pulling for the team, if you will. And I enjoyed that a lot. It was very pleasant.
Is it also a bit competitive since everybody is there trying to essentially their goal is to get on a mission?
Yes. Yeah, so that was the other interesting aspect of it. It was enjoyable because of everybody knew they had to be a team player, and everybody wanted to be a team player because they saw how daunting some of the demands of the missions were. But at the same time, when it came time to perform, you wanted to be performing better than everybody else so that you could kind of move to the head of the line, if you will.
You want to be a team player, but a team player a little better than the rest of the team.
Yeah, it's a little odd, but there is a little of that going on. Yeah. Yeah.
When did you first know that you were getting a mission?
So I think I was still Capcomming, and so they did two things that were kind of fun. When they called you first to be selected, they had one of the senior leaders at Johnson Space Center would call you on the phone and say, "Are you still really sure you want to be an astronaut?" You know, kind of walking you through this. And you could the word got out that you knew that if it was person A who called you, it was good news. If it was person B, it was bad news. They kind of did something similar when you were assigned to a mission. Some senior astronaut would come in and say, "Hey, we got a call to go over and meet with somebody in Building 1, which was the headquarters at Johnson Space Center." And, you know, if you'd been around long enough, you kind of started to wonder, I think this might be where they're going to tell me I'm on a crew. And you get over there and you get in an office and the rest of the crew's already there, and they sit you down and say, "You think you can fly with these folks?" And of course you say yes. So they do some fun things like that to keep the spirit up. So
That's very cool.
later,
Tell
when
me
I was
about
the chief astronaut, I had the privilege of being able to do that with a lot of the folks that I would put on a crew, you know, is to pull their leg. And one of the more enjoyable ones I did was to tell a young woman who was going to end up flying with me that she was getting another flight assignment. And so she was actually in a T-38 in the air, and I wanted to tell her in a unique way. So I went out to the ops counter at Ellington Field, and I got on the radio, and I radioed the airplane, and on the backup radio, I got to tell her while she was flying that she's going to get a flight assignment. So it was anything to keep it fun. So that was good.
That is very cool. Tell me about your first mission.
So I was on Columbia, and we were collaborative with the German Space Agency, and it was called D2, D for Deutsch. There had been an earlier mission that was collaborative with the German Space Agency back in before Challenger, and the way it had transpired, this was in the years before the European Space Agency had formed a single agency. A lot of the European countries had their own space agency. Germany had one, France had one, and so forth. Italy had their own agency. And then when they formed the European Union, they moved into the European Space Agency as a collective. But so this, in the 80s and 90s, the German Space Agency really wanted to leverage the capabilities of the shuttle to do scientific research. So they had flown a mission earlier with a payload module in the payload bay that was a little, probably 1.5 times longer than a school bus and maybe 1.5 times wider. And inside that payload bay module are 2 rows of racks, and in each of those racks are a series of experiments, all kinds of things, life science experiments, medical experiments, robotics experiments. There was a little robot arm inside of one of the panels that could be telemetry commanded from the ground as well as by an astronaut on board, and they were testing the lag time in the signal. Could this thing catch a ball if it was commanded from the ground with a delay in the signal and so forth? So a lot of scientific experiments that we conducted in the payload bay of the shuttle that are now what are done in the space station on a routine basis. So if you've seen videos of the space station's laboratory, we had a modest version of that in the payload bay of the shuttle. And the Germans designed all the experiments, and the U.S. provided the shuttle as the carrier, if you will. So we had two German payload specialists who joined us, Hans Schlegel and Ulrich Walter. And they trained with us for 16, 17 months before we flew. And we, as the American crew, supported their science with wherever a crew member was needed. They trained us to help support whatever functions the crew had to do to turn switches, take measurements, be guinea pigs to do blood samples, whatever it is that was part of that particular experiment. I think they did some 70 different experiments over the 10-day mission. It was quite successful. We even had some astronomy experiments with special cameras in the payload bay behind the module that we could point into the star field to take some imagery. A very, very successful program that was collaborated between Germany and the US. So quite different from what I did subsequent to that. And there was no inkling that we were about to join hands with the Russians on a big collaborative until that mission was well underway or almost over. And that was 1993. So we were just about to turn the corner with the Russians when I was doing that first flight.
Tell me about that, about what your experience was in working with the Russians.
Yeah, so if you think back to one of my favorite stories is to connect my previous life with the F-15. I had been flying in Germany out of a base called Bitburg, which has now been closed, but the base had a mission of defending the border between East and West Germany. This was before the wall came down. And routinely, we would have MiG aircraft show up on the border in East Germany, and we would scramble 4 F-15s to the border to make sure they didn't come across, and we'd wag wings and they'd go away. And lo and behold, we didn't, I could look into the cockpit of a MiG fighter and see a helmet and kind of wonder, what's this guy's life like? He's living behind the Iron Curtain. He's got a family and kids undoubtedly, and he loves flying too, or he wouldn't be there. But what's his life like? What are his dreams and aspirations? And we think we live on the free side of the world, and we've discovered since that we definitely have been living on the free side of the world. And then the wall comes down, and first it was Bush Sr. who thought that we ought to start a collaborative with the Russians. And then when Clinton was elected, he carried it on and said, yeah. And I remember taking the Russian crew in after that first docking to meet with Clinton in the Oval Office. And we basically, at one point, thanked him for helping us get the International Space Station going, because that's why we were working with the Russians. And he said, oh no, this is way more important than the space station. In so many words, he was saying, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. He wanted to make sure that we started to collaborate with the Russians in a way that would control international arms and the loss of nuclear capabilities to third world countries and so forth. And so the partnership that was struck with NASA was largely to help that international goal, that international relations goal that the administration had at the time. We were the beneficiaries of being able to be part of a breakthrough in relations, to be able to work with people that heretofore had been in a cockpit that I couldn't tell who the heck they were. And ironically, timing was just right. I got assigned to be the pilot on that first docking mission on Atlantis. Hoot Gibson was the commander, and we had a really great crew. And we'd take our first training trip to Russia. But I think the cosmonauts came to visit us first at Johnson Space Center, and we couldn't speak very well with each other. We were barely able to say hello in Russian, and they were barely able to say hello in English. And a few of them had a little better English, but we had interpreters with us all the time. And over time, we got pretty comfortable with each other's languages. And as you would guess, some people get better at it than others and become more adept at carrying on in the other language. But the first trip we made to Russia, lo and behold, I meet a cosmonaut pilot who had been in the MiG-23 in Germany at the same time I'd been flying the F-15. And we were trading stories about meeting each other at the border, wondering maybe we had met prior at some point in the air. And here we are. And over time, at different points, I was invited to come to dinner at his house, and we ended up on my second mission to the Mir. He was the commander, and we ended up becoming co-commanders of our respective cadres. I was the chief astronaut, he was the chief cosmonaut. So it's just an amazing turn in the state of play of our relations that I could go from maybe intercepting this guy on the inter-German border to flying next to him in space. It's just crazy.
That's
All
amazing.
in one short part of my career. It all just in a flash.
Did you get kind of some of your questions answered either directly or just indirectly by getting to spend time with him about what
Yeah.
it was like
So
for them to be on that side?
yeah, so very much so. And it's what they grew up with, so it's what they knew. There was a sort of cultural discipline that you don't question authority, and yet they had a very, very strong family orientation in the way they lived, and everything was always done in groups. They recognized they were poor, but they were very proud people, and they were very accomplished. And obviously, they were able to build a space station and fly crew on it. Did quite well, um, and yet their political system didn't allow them to advance to the degree that it could have. And so I think they saw, especially the younger folks in Russia, saw a huge opening advantage and opportunity to be able to work in collaboration with us to advance their own lives and their own, futures. And I think most of the younger folks in particular really enjoyed working with us, and we had great relations. What you learn really is that the interrelations you develop with small groups of people like that, we're all human, we all have, and they did have the same aspirations and hopes and dreams that we did, had great families, and if it weren't for the politics above us, we would be identical. It was just incredible to see how much we had in common. And it was very rewarding to be able to spend time with them to really learn to have them as friends, like we would have friends here in our own hometowns. So Vasily Tsiblev was the guy I'm talking about, and I ended up flying with him in a T-38 when he'd come to Johnson, and he got me to check out in a MiG-21 at the Russian test center in Moscow, and just incredible, in an hour I couldn't give you all the great things that I took away from that relationship. And it's just a great thing that was started there, and we all had hopes that it could expand to the whole culture of both countries. And of course, that's probably many decades in front of us still, but it showed that when you can connect people well, like that program did, they can do incredible things and transcends where you came from. And it was really kind of neat.
One of the things that I find fascinating is it's true certainly that this time period that you're talking about was one of warming relations, and a kind of an opening up of Russia at the time that we're quite far from now.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it seems that the connections that are at least slightly to the side of politics, they're all political, but slightly to the side with like scientific partnerships for exploration of space or for other purposes. Though it seems like those communication channels, even when each side despises each other, serve a purpose that keeps us safe and it allows us to reconnect. What are your thoughts on that?
That's exactly what we all hoped that the space station could bring for both countries. It's still small on the scale of national interest, even though the station is a very expensive and very high risk operation, and yet it brings such good things to both peoples in the US and in Russia and in the other international partners for that matter who take part in it. The hope was that it would always keep everyone questioning making a move politically or militarily that would jeopardize our relationships to where we couldn't have that. And so by the fact that we have it, we have hope that we can grow from it into other things that we share that are too important to both players to jeopardize. And so one can only hope that the Moon Mars program can do that too. And that's why we have, in that program with Artemis, we've reached out to make that an international endeavor as well. A lot of times you can say the international partnerships are less expensive. You could probably debate that till the cows come home, because it's more complex to organize an international technical endeavor. But it does bring other ways of thinking and other ideas that can sometimes be very powerful in terms of productivity. But what it certainly does do is make sure that we all are working together towards a common good for all the countries that are willing to participate. So it keeps each country who has started to participate wanting to stay involved as well. You're less likely to pull out of a program when other partners are depending on you too, right? So there's a lot of good things that come from an international partnership like that. It becomes more sustainable once it's stood up.
Yeah, it is fascinating that those bridges make a big difference to maintaining connection and reconnection. And as you're mentioning, the Mars or future programs, staying engaged with an adversary seems important.
Yes. Yeah, I think that is as much as it hurts to see what's going on in the Ukraine right now. We can only hope that that gets done and over with and resolved quickly in a good way. But it's ironic because one of the first pictures we took after that first docking in '95, once we docked, you've probably seen these pictures, but at the docking mechanism, there's a hatch on either side. And so you open both hatches and you can actually transition from inside the shuttle to inside the Mir station. We went up inside the Mir station, we were able to look back at the nose of the shuttle itself, and we were flying over the Black Sea. There it is, you found it, look at you. So that's the Crimean Peninsula on the right in that issue, in that Odessa and the Crimean Peninsula in the Black Sea. How coincidental is that to being the first picture that ended up on the cover of Aviation Week is right over the territory that's now in contention with Russians and Americans aboard. So a wonderful picture. It really turned out well. Greg Harbaugh, who was our flight engineer, took that picture. It's gorgeous.
Yeah,
that was before digital cameras too.
that's just why it's so good.
Yeah.
This is I think another iconic one from that.
So that's Vasily, the guy I've been talking about, Vasily Tsabliev, and that was on my second docking when we opened the hatches after contact between the shuttle and the Mir. He welcomed us inside, and of course we'd been friends for several years by this point. It was in 1997, and so we probably first met in 93, early 93, late 93.
Wow. And that was the launch.
Yeah, that was the launch for that second flight to go to Vasily. That was STS-84 night launch, and that vehicle was pretty darn impressive. It's putting out 7 million pounds of thrust right there. It's a lot of energy, and that's the landing at Kennedy.
Perfect landing, by the way.
Touching down at well. You always walk away with a little critique. Touching down at 195 knots, it's moving.
I know Barry and Brian Schiff have both described their time with you in the simulator.
Yeah, that was quite a day.
That you made some memories, I think, that last entire lives with that. But
it's such a unique thing, we spent the day together and we started in a little smaller desktop sim to give them some sense of the systems and the displays, and then we did a tour, and then we ended up in the shuttle simulator for simulating launch and reentry and landings. So they got a big dose of everything, but the fun part, of course, is when you give them the stick and let them land it from 40,000 feet. So it's pretty neat. Well, it takes about 5 minutes to come down from 40,000 feet, so it's quite the deal.
Are you still in contact with the Russian cosmonauts that you worked with at the time?
Not regularly. It's been quite a while now, and it's a little difficult given the conditions. The folks that are on duty and actively still in the program are able to, that both agencies understand the requirement that they communicate, but it's pretty difficult to
Mm.
just up and call them. So I've not
Yeah.
done that in a while.
You mentioned going all the way back to when you were flying patrol on the East German
Yeah.
border. We've had NORAD on the show a number of times, and it is fascinating to me and encouraging in a way that no matter how difficult things are, there's a certain connection and kind of way of doing things that happens between the pilots on both sides of that. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, there's kind of an understanding about the rules of intercept and rules of engagement and so forth. And when one of the more entertaining intercepts I made was on a Russian Mir bomber over the North Sea, and we were doing it for several days. And first day we went up, we had a sign that said "Privyet," which is hello in Russian. And then the next day we went up, it was a different crew, of course, but the word had gotten around, and so the tail gunner had a sign that said "Hello, how are you?" So there's an understanding and an etiquette, a respect that is pretty neat between pilots, crews like that.
Well, I guess those are the big question, and the thing that happens during, when we talk with NORAD is what is it that keeps something unintentionally from getting out of control, and that's the people on the front line.
Yeah, yeah, very much so. I think they recognize that they can't make a mistake and cause something to go, high order, be regrettable. So they're careful, disciplined, and respectful.
How do you feel looking forward now about the the way that the program, the entire space program, is now changing and privatizing and where it's going? What are your thoughts on both the positives and some of the risks to that?
Yeah. So the first thing is the excitement has been tremendous. When Apollo was so exciting for this country, it was because it was truly an international consideration for national security that we had to beat the Russians to the moon, or we potentially would see our way of life threatened. At least that was the perception. So we threw a lot of money at it from a national security interest standpoint. I would say that 15 years, maybe even 20 years ago, you could have said, absent a driver like that, we might not reinvest in space like we did then. But the fascinating thing is that a lot of private interests found that with modern technologies and the advancements in capabilities, they were able to actually make investments in space that could get them a return, and they didn't need as much dependence on the government funding. Now, I will stop right there for a second and say there's still a huge amount of government funding that goes into especially human spaceflight, because it'll be a long time before you can charge 5 or 6 individuals enough money to pay for a full mission. But there are other ancillary parts of those missions that do pay back. And it started with satellites being able to generate revenues for companies that provided meteorology and communications, particularly communications. Satellite communications is a very large industry, and it's totally private and generates a lot of revenues. And so people over time learned how to exploit space and the assets there for a positive revenue. That is a real good thing, because it's brought a lot of cash into the development of these future programs. And even though something like Artemis has still an impressive amount of government funding, a lot of other companies are becoming part of the ecosystem that are feeding it, contributing it, getting some return from government contracts while also bolstering their growth of their business to make some private return on it. So it's way better situation than we had in Apollo, where it was strictly government. Now, I will say that when you have to, so that's all positive. Now, this isn't really negative, but it's a caveat, and that is that it's not just commercial money. If there were only commercial money, it's more to be thought of as the contract mechanism for the government money is different than it had been. There's a lot of fixed price contracts. There's a lot of work that's done and handed over to the contractors with more freedom than was traditionally done. And so that has accelerated commercial companies' ability to perform and to bring product. And so there's a spectrum of, depending on how technically challenging something is, to how repeatable it is. Something that's brand new and hasn't been done much, the government and its engineers stay very, very much involved, and it's very much a government-only contract, whereas something that is delivering hardware and computers to Elon Musk's Dragon vehicles is something he can do on his own. Mm-hmm. So the balance is shifting more to commercial, but it is not all commercial funded is the thing I just want to get out there, is that there's still a lot of government money to make this work and needs to be there to make it work. But it's bringing much, much more commercial money into it as well.
Do you think that it lessens or puts at risk the kind of trickle down of technology and the benefits that society as a whole got from, when you look at the Apollo program, when you look at those other programs, so many things that are part of all of our lives all the time, from Velcro to you name it, to computers, were benefits that came out from all that. Is any of that at risk?
I don't think so. Again, it comes back to an understanding of the different type of contractual mechanism. So those things that came out of that, even back in the Apollo day, those were companies like Northrop Grumman and Rockwell American and Grumman and what eventually became Boeing's involvement in it and Lockheed's involvement in it. Those large companies were still private companies doing and performing the work for NASA. So it was more the need, the technical need, that drove the innovation, and NASA defining what those needs were. And in those days, NASA was much more embedded and involved in driving the companies to do the work, as opposed to now the needs are evolving in a more natural way, that the companies that are involved are saying, okay, I see a need and I can bring an innovative way of solving it, and then NASA taps into it. So it's growing so fast that it's the ability to generate innovation is not necessarily just strictly on the NASA side anymore. People are seeing pathways that are not just solely the purview of the government, which is good. So
that's wonderful. Well, it sounds like you're very bullish on the future of space exploration.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely.
That's great. Well, Charlie, we like to, as we come towards the top of the hour, end every show with something that we call SocialFlights Fast Five, and that is just 5 questions that there's no right, wrong answer. They're just to you. It's sort of think of it a speed round interview that we can also give everyone a little separate. Is that something you're okay with?
That sounds good.
All right, Charlie Precourt, this is your SocialFlights Fast Five, and we're going to start with question number 1, which is you have flown a lot of different things from aircraft to spacecraft. What's your favorite? What's the favorite aircraft if you had to pick something for flying?
The F-15 has to pop out first. It had so much maneuverability. It could be flown as an extension of your hands and feet, and it did whatever you asked it to do. And it was just an amazing mission. And the mission itself was very competitive, very athletic, very physically demanding. And I enjoyed the heck out of it. Like I say, it's a young man's sport. I wish I could go back. But okay. I've never met an airplane I didn't like, and they all have their own goods and bads to them, and you learn to understand them as their own personality, and that's part of the fun too.
Okay, well, question number 2, and this maybe as a test pilot you have a unique perspective on, but what was the scariest flying moment that you have had?
A near midair with a wingman and an F-15. We were engaged in I think we were flying 4 F-15s against 8, maybe 10 F-5 aggressors, and my wingman made a a mistake and maneuvered across my nose, and we almost collided. And I didn't even see it coming, so there wasn't anything I was going to do about it. So it's the closest near miss ever that I've in my career, anyway. Because it could have ended differently, and I wouldn't have had anything to do about it.
Wow.
But you know, there's a lot of I think anybody who's flown an airplane has some kind of a near miss experience with something, and it's when it sticks with you and teaches you something that is what matters out of it, right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, you have to handle an emergency, you learn the system better. You have to take care of something in bad weather, you learn to watch the weather better. So all those things teach you something, but that one will always stick in the front of my mind. I can still see the belly of his airplane 15 feet in front of my nose. Didn't even know where he came from. So,
Wow.
yeah.
Well, that is definitely hair-raising. All right. Question number 3. You have had some unbelievable moments in your life. If you had the opportunity to go back just to be there in the moment for 5, 10, 15 minutes to relive something, where would you go back and do and experience one more time?
Probably the docking segment, taking the shuttle up, and the last 15 minutes or so of the docking is really dynamic and a lot of fun. It's probably in a tie for just relaxing in the commander's seat and watching the Earth go by. That view of the Earth is you're never going to forget it. It's amazing.
I believe every astronaut I've ever met said that was life-changing, that just seeing that.
It is, because it looks like, you know, everything around the Earth is black, and it looks like the Earth's glowing from inside until you go around the backside into the night half of the orbit, and then all the lights on the ground start popping out, and lightning from thunderstorms are going off all the time. It's just an incredible view. It really is.
Wow. All right, question number 4. If there was one thing that you wish that you knew back in either your teens or your 20s, you could go back and tell yourself, your younger self, what advice would you give?
Oh my gosh. Uh, that's a tough one. I don't have any regrets, and that's why it's tough. I guess I would say maybe try a few other things besides just engineering. Maybe a little more music or something. I don't know.
You know what? For someone with very few regrets, that is a good enough answer right there. Just go back and say, just keep doing what you're doing.
Exactly. Yeah. Keep on keeping on.
All
Yeah.
right, and the last question of Social Flight's Fast 5 is, if you had the opportunity to have dinner, have a chat with anyone you can think of, alive or dead, and get a chance to spend some time with them, who would you perhaps want to pick their brain or spend some time with?
Oh my gosh, I could come up with a lot of people there. Probably Winston Churchill.
Really? That's
Yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah. Just his strategic thinking, the challenges he dealt with and how he dealt with them. I just think the folks that got us through World War II were amazing. And I picked his name because I think he was a key player in the strategy of how we got there and what's getting the Americans into the war. But um, I mean, his country was right there on the front line and in the middle of, you know, being attacked constantly. But anyone who, you know, contributed to World War II for the benefit of us is, you know, way up there in my book. They're the greatest generation, not for, it's not for unknown reasons that we call them that, right? So I just respect so many people that had a lot to do with that.
That is a truly wonderful answer. I literally think about that now and think, oh my God, would that be wonderful? It seems like it wouldn't be a meal though. I think it would be like a cigar and like a drink.
Exactly. Exactly.
That is fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Charlie, for playing along with that, and for taking time out of your evening to join us here on Social Flight Live. Your story is fantastic. Your insights are wonderful, and I hope that we'll have a chance to have you back sometime in the future.
My pleasure. It was fun. Thanks, Jeff.
And also, I also do want to thank you. You serve on the board for so many organizations, EAA, so many others. There's so much work you're doing that we didn't have any time to just brush the surface of, but I want everyone to know out there to know how much you contribute to general aviation and serving the cause. And so just please accept a thank you on behalf of me and all of our Social Flight members and viewers.
Thank you. Pleasure.
All right. Have a wonderful evening.
You too, Jeff. Thanks a lot.
Good night.
Bye.
And thanks so much to you as well for taking time out of your evening to join us here on Social Flight Live and for everything you do to support general aviation. The weather is getting better, flying is happening, things are just booming all across the United States. And I encourage all of you, please go to socialflight.com, check it out, find places to fly and things to do. Please go to the App Store and give us that 5-star review. We really do appreciate it. It helps all of us support all of you. We'll be off next week down at Sun and Fun and uploading some content. There'll be videos on our YouTube channel from Sun and Fun and doing our best to connect with everyone down there. If I bump into one of you down there, please come over and say hi. Love to spend some time and get to connect with you. In addition, then we are back on Tuesday, April 16th with Jack Pelton, and we're going to talk about an EAA AirVenture preview for AirVenture 2024 with Jack, and that promises to be a really, really fun show. And then on Tuesday, April 23rd at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, John and Martha King will be here on the show, and they are celebrating the 50th anniversary of King Schools. Until next time, I'm Jeff Simon for Social Flight, and I wish you all blue skies.